I'm Rachel.
Deckard.
Once upon a time, Sean Young was Hollywood's next big thing, stunning, confident, and wildly talented. With her unforgettable roles in Blade Runner and No Way Out, she had the kind of beauty and intensity that made directors fight to cast her. Sean wasn't just another actress. She was a phenomenon in the making. But just as quickly as she rose, she vanished from the spotlight, leaving behind one of the strangest and most heartbreaking Hollywood stories ever told. In the 1980s, she was poised to become the next Meryl Streep, a superstar with depth and daring. But then came whispers of on-set feuds, unpredictable behavior, and bizarre public appearances that changed everything. By the early 90s, her name was more often linked to scandal than success. For years, Sean became Hollywood's cautionary tale, a woman too outspoken, too bold, and too fearless for an industry that expected silence. Behind those tabloid headlines, however, was a woman fighting battles no one understood. A career sabotaged not just by controversy, but by an industry that punished her for being different. She was blacklisted, humiliated, and left to rebuild her life in a world that had already moved on. Now, decades later, people are asking the same haunting question: what really happened to Sean Young? How did one of the most promising stars of her generation become one of Hollywood's most misunderstood outcasts? This is the shocking truth behind Sean Young's rise, her downfall, and the quiet redemption that most never knew she achieved. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hollywood was a place where beauty and obedience went hand in hand. Studios shaped their stars carefully. Women were expected to smile, follow directions, and never question the system. But then came Sean Young, bold, brilliant, and refreshingly unpredictable. She didn't fit the mold, and that's exactly what made her unforgettable. Born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1959, Sean had an energy that couldn't be contained. After studying dance and working as a model, she moved to New York City, where her striking features and fierce intelligence immediately turned heads. It wasn't long before Hollywood noticed. Her first major role came in 1980's Jane Austen in Manhattan, directed by James Ivory, but it was her breakout performance in Blade Runner 1982 that changed everything. Opposite Harrison Ford, Sean played Rachel, the mysterious replicant, cool, elegant, and strangely human. Her performance was mesmerizing, layered with emotion and control. Critics praised her, fans adored her, and Hollywood seemed ready to crown her the next great leading lady. But behind the camera, tensions were brewing. Sean's outspoken personality clashed with the rigid atmosphere of a big-budget set. She was young, confident, and unwilling to play the good girl role expected of her, a trait that would later define and destroy her Hollywood career. After Blade Runner, she landed another high-profile role in Dune, 1984. Once again, her screen presence was undeniable. She had that rare combination of poise and intensity that made her stand out in every scene. Industry insiders compared her to Katharine Hepburn, strong, smart, and completely her own person. But while the world saw a rising star behind the scenes, Sean was already developing a reputation as difficult. She questioned directors, challenged scripts, and refused to be treated as a decorative figure. Then came No Way Out, 1987, the film that cemented her status as one of Hollywood's most exciting actresses. Starring alongside Kevin Costner and Gene Hackman, Sean delivered a powerful and sensual performance that electrified audiences. The movie was a hit, and for a brief moment it seemed like Sean Young had everything: talent, fame, and limitless potential. But the higher she climbed, the more resistance she faced. Hollywood wasn't kind to women who spoke their minds, and Sean did more than speak. She roared. In an industry built on control, her confidence was seen as arrogance. Rumors of her being uncooperative or unstable began to swirl, many of them exaggerated or completely false. Still, in the competitive world of movie making, perception mattered more than truth. By the late 1980s, Sean was no longer just known for her performances. She was known for her controversies. Directors began hesitating to cast her, studios grew wary, and the press started circling like vultures. Yet through it all, Sean remained defiant. She once said in an interview, "I'm not here to play their game. I'm here to act." What no one realized at the time was that her refusal to conform, the very thing that made her stand out, would soon become the reason Hollywood turned its back on her. At the height of her fame, Sean Young had everything an actress could dream of: beauty, skill, and momentum. But the higher she soared, the more dangerous her independence became in an industry that thrived on obedience. And soon that independence would cost her everything. By the late 1980s, Sean Young was no longer just Hollywood's rising star. She had become one of its most talked-about figures, and not for the reasons she deserved. Her natural confidence and unwillingness to submit to industry politics were rebranded by tabloids as arrogance, and soon, one rumor after another began to chip away at the promising career she had built. It started subtly: whispers on film sets, strained relationships with directors, and stories of her being difficult. But the real shift came during the filming of Wall Street, 1987. Sean was cast as the wife of Charlie Sheen's character, but her screen time was drastically reduced after reported disagreements with director Oliver Stone. Insiders claimed she had clashed with Stone over creative choices, while others said she simply refused to be treated disrespectfully. Either way, her reputation as hard to work with grew louder than her actual talent. But the incident that truly defined her downfall came in 1989 with Batman. Sean was originally cast as Vicky Vale, the female lead opposite Michael Keaton. Just days before filming began, she suffered a riding accident and broke her arm, forcing her to withdraw. The role went to Kim Basinger, and with it, the chance for Sean to star in what became one of the biggest blockbusters of the decade. A few years later, when casting began for Batman Returns, 1992, Sean made headlines again, this time for a bizarre public stunt. Determined to play Catwoman, she famously arrived at Warner Brothers in full costume, uninvited, demanding to audition for the role. The media turned it into a spectacle. Late-night shows mocked her. Headlines called her crazy. What the public didn't see was the desperation behind her actions. A talented actress, once adored, now fighting to prove she still belonged. The ridicule was relentless. Producers distanced themselves and directors quietly stopped returning her calls. Hollywood had made up its mind. Sean Young was no longer worth the risk. She was blacklisted, unofficially but effectively. Roles dried up overnight. And by the early 1990s, the woman who once starred opposite Harrison Ford and Kevin Costner was struggling to find work at all. Adding to the turmoil were a series of personal controversies. Sean spoke openly about facing unwanted advances from powerful men in the industry, including directors who later retaliated when she refused them. In a time before the Me Too movement, her words were dismissed and she was labeled unstable for daring to speak out. Years later, her claims would gain credibility, but by then, the damage was already done. Behind the scenes, Sean was also battling emotional exhaustion. The endless criticism, media mockery, and professional isolation pushed her to the edge. She became withdrawn, and her public appearances, often portrayed as erratic, were fueled by frustration, not madness. "I wasn't crazy," she once said, reflecting on that period. "I was angry. I was heartbroken. I wanted to be heard." The media, however, preferred a scandal to a story of survival. The more Sean tried to explain, the worse the headlines became. She went from Hollywood's next great actress to a punchline almost overnight. By the mid-1990s, Sean Young had been all but erased from the industry that once celebrated her. She took small television roles, independent films, and even stepped away entirely at times to focus on her family. But the stigma never faded. In Hollywood, forgiveness is often granted to men who misbehave, but rarely to women who refuse to obey. And for Sean Young, the price of her defiance was exile. Still, she never stopped believing she was wronged. "They didn't want me because I told the truth," she once said. But the truth has a way of surviving. Her fall from grace wasn't the result of one scandal. It was the result of a system that punished her for being unafraid. But even after losing everything, Sean wasn't finished yet. The next chapter of her life would prove that the woman Hollywood tried to silence would never stop fighting to be heard again. When the lights of Hollywood dimmed for Sean Young, they didn't fade gently. They vanished almost overnight. One year, she was gracing magazine covers, commanding red carpets, and headlining major studio films. The next, she was an outcast, her name whispered in executive offices as a warning, not an opportunity. The world had moved on, and for Sean, it was as though she had simply ceased to exist. The 1990s became a long, quiet exile. Roles that once came easily were gone, replaced by small parts in low-budget or independent films. When she did appear on screen, critics often ignored her work or mentioned her name only in passing, as if she were a ghost from another era. It was heartbreaking for someone who had once been hailed as one of the most promising actresses of her generation, but Sean refused to disappear completely. She kept working wherever she could, appearing in films like Cousins, 1989, A Kiss Before Dying, 1991, and later Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, 1994. In Ace Ventura, her role as Lieutenant Lois Einhorn brought her back into the public eye, but not in the way she hoped. The movie's comedic twist made her the target of ridicule again, and rather than rebuilding her career, it reinforced the image of her as an eccentric, polarizing figure. Behind the scenes, Sean was fighting deeper battles. She had begun to struggle with depression and anger over how her career had been taken from her. She knew she had made mistakes, being outspoken, defiant, and sometimes unfiltered, but she also knew she had been treated unfairly. Hollywood had forgiven men for far worse, yet for her, redemption never seemed to come. In interviews, Sean often spoke about the loneliness of those years. She described how phone calls stopped coming, friends disappeared, and offers vanished. Directors who once promised her lifelong collaborations stopped returning her messages. It was as though she had been erased by an invisible hand. But through all the rejection, she maintained her spirit. "You can't destroy me," she once said. "You can only ignore me." To survive, Sean turned inward. She focused on her family, raising her 2 sons and finding comfort in motherhood. Away from Hollywood's chaos, she found something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. She also started painting, directing, and exploring her creative side beyond acting. While the world labeled her difficult, she quietly rebuilt her identity through art and reflection. Occasionally, she tried to re-enter the Hollywood circle, appearing on reality TV shows like Celebrity, Rehab, and The Celebrity Apprentice in the 2000s. These appearances were often met with mockery. Rather than respect, but for Sean, they were opportunities to show the world that she was still standing. Beneath the eccentricity that the media fixated on was a woman who simply refused to give up. By the 2010s, there was a small but growing movement to reevaluate her legacy. Younger audiences discovered her performances in Blade Runner and No Way Out, realizing just how magnetic she had been. Film enthusiasts began to argue that Sean Young had been unfairly treated, that her downfall said more about Hollywood's misogyny than her talent. For Sean, it was a bittersweet validation. She had been right all along, but recognition had come decades too late. Still, she never lost her humor. In interviews, she joked about her blacklisting, calling it Hollywood's version of a bad breakup. Beneath the laughter, though, was truth, a woman who had been deeply wounded but refused to surrender her dignity. While many actresses of her generation retired gracefully or faded away quietly, Sean Young's story was different. Hers was a tale of survival, of a woman who lost everything the industry could take but never allowed it to take her identity. In her own words, "I didn't disappear. They tried to make me disappear, but I'm still here." And indeed she was, not as the fallen star Hollywood once mocked, but as a survivor of one of the cruelest betrayals in show business history. In the years that followed her Hollywood exile, Sean Young quietly built a life far from the bright lights and flashing cameras that once defined her world. She no longer chased the fame that had once consumed her. Instead, she sought peace, stability, and perhaps a little bit of dignity after decades of public scrutiny. Living in New York with her husband, Robert Lugin, and their 2 sons, Young embraced a slower, simpler life centered around her family and creativity. Though she was no longer appearing in blockbuster films, Shawn never stopped being an artist at heart. She continued to act in smaller independent projects, often taking roles that allowed her to explore complex emotions without the interference of Hollywood politics. Her work in indie films like Darling 2015 and A Kiss Before Dying proved that the spark that once made her a star had never truly faded. It had only been dimmed by the industry's unforgiving glare. But perhaps the most surprising part of her journey was her sense of humor and resilience. While many expected her to become bitter about her past, Shawn instead leaned into it with honesty. In interviews, she often spoke candidly about how she had been misunderstood, how ambition and personality were treated differently for women in her era, and how she was punished for speaking her mind. "If I were a man," she once said, "I'd have been called eccentric or bold. But because I was a woman, I was labeled difficult." Over time, fans who once judged her began to see her story in a new light. In the era of social media and renewed conversations about sexism in Hollywood, Shawn's struggles began to look less like scandal and more like survival. The same outspokenness that once got her blacklisted now seemed prophetic, a reflection of how ahead of her time she truly was. Today, Shawn Young stands as a symbol of both the glamour and cruelty of fame. She may never have received the Hollywood comeback she deserved, but she gained something arguably more valuable: self-awareness, forgiveness, and a voice that refuses to be silenced. Her journey reminds us that behind every tabloid headline lies a human being, trying to navigate a system that often chews up the very talent it once celebrated.